The sun hung high over the Pacific, casting harsh, unrelenting rays on the vast expanse of ocean below. The thundering roar of aircraft engines shattered the stillness of the sky as two rival forces met in a deadly embrace above the clouds. It was April 1944, a pivotal moment in the Pacific War. Below, the blue waters churned beneath a battlefield far above, where pilots fought not just for survival, but for the fate of nations. In the distance, the unmistakable silhouettes of Japanese Zero fighters cut through the air, sleek and lethal, their engines growling with aggression. Opposite them, the P-51 Mustangs, with their distinct nose and powerful engines, sliced through the air like a storm unleashed. Their American pilots, focused and resolute, knew this was no ordinary encounter. The Mustangs had earned a reputation for their speed, their firepower, and their unwavering precision. Today, they would live up to that legacy. The moment was electric, the tension thick enough to slice through. The P-51s dove down with a roar, their wings cutting through the air as they locked onto their targets. A split second later, the sky erupted in flashes of light as the first wave of bullets tore through the fuselage of a Zero, sending it spiraling into the abyss below. The squadron of Japanese pilots, stunned and disoriented, could only watch in horror as their comrades fell, one by one. The overwhelming power of the Mustangs had taken them completely by surprise, and in the chaos that ensued, the Japanese pilots could do nothing but beg for mercy as their formation crumbled around them. The year was 1944, and the Pacific War had reached a crucial juncture. The Axis forces, led by Imperial Japan, had once enjoyed near total dominance in the skies above the Pacific. However, the tides were beginning to turn. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States had undergone a remarkable transformation, shifting from a defensive posture to a fully offensive one. As the Allies launched successive campaigns across the Pacific, the struggle for air superiority became one of the most significant battles fought above the waves of the ocean. The Japanese Zero, introduced in 1940, had been a dominant force early in the war. With its light frame, exceptional maneuverability, and devastating firepower, it was an unmatched adversary for any Allied fighter. For a time, the Zero was the undisputed king of the skies, striking fear into the hearts of Allied pilots. But as the war dragged on, the Allied forces adapted, developing new tactics and technology to counter the Japanese threat. By 1944, a game-changer had arrived in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang. Initially designed as a long-range bomber escort, the Mustang proved to be far more than that. With its exceptional speed, firepower, and range, it quickly became one of the most effective fighter aircraft ever built. The P-51 Mustang's Merlin engine, a British-engineered masterpiece, allowed it to reach speeds that rivaled the best Axis fighters. Its ability to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, while also holding its own in dogfights, made it a potent tool in the Allied arsenal. The American High Command, recognizing the potential of the Mustang, deployed it in increasing numbers across the Pacific theater. The P-51s began to replace older, slower aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk, which had struggled against the more nimble Japanese fighters. With the Mustangs taking to the skies, the days of Japanese air superiority were numbered. The battle that would unfold in the skies above the Pacific was not only a clash of steel and engines, but of wills. On one side, the seasoned Japanese pilots, trained to fight with tenacity and precision. On the other, the newly emboldened American pilots, backed by superior technology and relentless determination. The Mustangs, flying high above the Pacific, would test the strength of the Japanese resolve, and soon, that resolve would be shattered. The P-51 Mustang was not born out of a desire for revenge or military bravado. It was a necessity. As the war raged on, Allied bombers had to penetrate deeper into enemy territory, requiring a fighter escort capable of safeguarding them from the relentless Japanese interceptors. Early attempts at bomber escorts, such as the P-40 Warhawk and the P-47 Thunderbolt, proved inadequate for the job. Their speed and range were limited, and they often found themselves outmatched by the swift and deadly Zeros. In 1940, North American Aviation, under contract from the U.S. Army Air Force's USAF, began designing what would become the P-51 Mustang. Originally conceived as a quick, inexpensive design to fill a gap in the bomber escort role, the P-51 underwent significant modifications. Its original Allison engine was replaced with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a decision that would turn the Mustang into a true powerhouse. This change made the P-51 a long-range, high-performance fighter, capable of reaching altitudes and speeds that put it on par with or even exceeded the capabilities of its Japanese counterparts. One of the key advantages of the Mustang was its ability to fly at higher altitudes and maintain that performance over long distances. This capability gave the P-51 the range needed to protect bombers as they made their way to key strategic targets in Japan and other occupied territories. By the spring of 1944, the Mustangs were an integral part of the air war, and their impact was becoming increasingly evident. On the other side, Japan's air forces had been dealt severe blows over the previous years. The Battle of Midway in 1942, followed by the loss of key Pacific islands and airfields, had diminished their ability to replace aircraft and train pilots. The once feared Zeros were being outclassed by newer American fighters, and the Japanese air forces were increasingly under strain. Despite this, the Japanese military remained resolute. They would not give up control of the skies without a fierce fight. However, as the war in the Pacific stretched into 1944, the Japanese could no longer ignore the escalating threat posed by the P-51 Mustangs. These American fighters had the ability to strike deep into Japanese-held territory and outmatch the Zeros in almost every aspect. The balance of power was shifting, and the Japanese knew it. The stage was set for a dramatic clash in the skies, a clash that would not only shape the future of the Pacific War, but also forever change the nature of aerial combat. The Japanese pilots, trained in the ways of the Zero, had never encountered a force like the P-51 Mustang, and they were about to learn the true meaning of aerial dominance. In the skies above the Pacific, every pilot's story was marked by a blend of fear, hope, and relentless determination. On both sides, men who had never met were bound by the same mortal desire to survive the battle and complete their missions. For the American pilots flying the P-51 Mustangs, the stakes were clear. They were the tip of the spear in the push to secure Allied victory. For many, the Mustang was their first experience in a fighter aircraft. Many were young, fresh-faced boys who had grown up in the shadow of war, thrust into combat with little more than the training and the idealism instilled in them. Lieutenant James Jimmy McGovern, a P-51 pilot from the 353rd Fighter Squadron, often reflected on the brotherhood he found in the cockpit of his Mustang. "We all knew the stakes," he said, "but we trusted our planes and our fellow pilots. When you're out there, high above the ocean, the only thing that matters is making sure you are there for the guy next to you." The Japanese pilots, however, faced a different kind of pressure. They were veterans of some of the fiercest early battles in the Pacific. Men like Captain Kenji Kojima Arakawa, who had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and the loss of key airfields, were fighting not only for survival, but for their honor and their country. The Japanese pilots, trained in the deadly art of dogfighting, prided themselves on their exceptional aerial skills, honed through years of practice in the Zero. But the arrival of the P-51 Mustang challenged everything they knew about aerial combat. Arakawa, who had faced numerous American fighters before, knew that this new threat would demand a level of precision and skill his squadron had never before encountered. "We had always dominated the skies," he later recalled. "But this Mustang, it was different. It could match us in every way and outdo us in others." For both the American and Japanese pilots, the battle was not just a clash of machines, but a test of their own courage, skill, and endurance. The adrenaline was always high, each dogfight an intimate, brutal struggle for control of the skies. The tactical angle dominating the skies. The P-51 Mustang supremacy was not just a matter of speed or firepower. It was a combination of strategic design, advanced technology, and tactical ingenuity that made it a fearsome opponent for any fighter aircraft. When the P-51s entered the fray, they did so with a tactical advantage that fundamentally altered the dynamics of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The Mustang's main strength was its long-range capability, made possible by the high-performance Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Unlike other fighters, which were often limited by fuel reserves, the P-51s could fly at distances that allowed them to escort bombers deep into Japanese territory. This was critical for the success of Allied bombing campaigns, which had often been thwarted by the Japanese fighters that attacked bombers long before they reached their targets. Additionally, the Mustang's design allowed it to engage enemy aircraft with exceptional maneuverability, especially at higher altitudes. The P-51's large, elliptical wings were well suited to high-speed combat, providing a balance of speed, agility, and stability that outclassed many of its contemporaries, including the Japanese Zero. The Zero, although deadly in close-range dogfights, struggled to keep up with the Mustang's speed and ability to stay at high altitudes for extended periods of time. The P-51's weaponry, including 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, allowed it to unleash a devastating amount of firepower when engaging enemy fighters. During the spring of 1944, American pilots began using the P-51's superior range and firepower to devastating effect. Their tactics included diving from high altitudes and attacking the Japanese Zeros from behind, catching the enemy pilots off guard and destroying their aircraft before they even had time to respond. For the Japanese pilots, facing the P-51 Mustang in combat was a bitter realization. Initially, they had been accustomed to exploiting their speed and nimbleness to outmaneuver their adversaries. But the Mustang's ability to match or exceed those same traits, coupled with its longer operational range, shifted the balance. The Zeros, though still nimble and highly capable at lower altitudes, could not compete with the Mustang's sustained combat ability. As the dogfights unfolded, the Japanese pilots began to realize their fighters were outclassed. The Mustang's ability to outmaneuver the Zeros in the vertical, combined with their superior endurance and firepower, created a new set of challenges for the Japanese air forces. For the first time, the Japanese pilots were forced to adapt quickly to a battle they had once dominated. The moment that would forever change the course of the battle in the Pacific came suddenly, a thunderous clash high above the Pacific Ocean. It was April 1944, and the skies were filled with the deafening roar of engines as American P-51 Mustangs engaged a squadron of Japanese Zeros. The Allied bombers had already passed their targets, and now the P-51s were on the hunt. In the distance, a formation of Japanese Zero fighters was approaching, eager to challenge the intruders. It was a perfect ambush, one that the Japanese pilots had anticipated many times before, but never with the overwhelming power that the Mustangs brought to the table. The American pilots, flying in tight formations, saw their targets below. They swooped in from above with a precision and deadly efficiency that would soon become the hallmark of the P-51 Mustang's reputation. Captain Edward "Eddie" Reynolds, leading the squadron, signaled his pilots to break into a high-speed dive. The Mustang's engines roared as they plummeted toward the Zeros. The initial impact was swift. Reynolds and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy "Rusty" Allen, opened fire, sending a Japanese Zero spiraling out of control and crashing into the ocean below. But this was just the beginning. The Zero pilots, skilled and experienced as they were, tried to break formation and escape, but the speed and agility of the P-51 Mustangs made it nearly impossible. The Japanese fighters scattered, desperately trying to dodge the incoming fire, but the Mustangs stayed locked on. The first wave of Zeros fell quickly, their pilots either killed or forced to bail out. But then, the American pilots turned their attention to the remaining members of the squadron, who had begun to break away in confusion. In one of the most remarkable moments of the engagement, as the P-51s made their second pass, the surviving Japanese pilots began to realize the magnitude of the disaster. One after another, they tried to escape, diving, climbing, and twisting in the air. But it was futile. As the Mustangs tore through their ranks with unrelenting accuracy, the Japanese pilots began to call out over their radios, the desperation in their voices palpable. The P-51s, relentless in their assault, had wiped out more than half of the Japanese squadron in mere minutes. The tide had shifted, and the Japanese air superiority that had once seemed unassailable was now a fading memory. The chaos in the skies was palpable. With the majority of their squadron lost in the span of minutes, the Japanese pilots were forced into desperate measures. The once formidable Zero fighters, known for their agility and combat prowess, were now on the back foot, outclassed by the precision and firepower of the P-51 Mustangs. As they veered and twisted in the sky, trying in vain to escape, the remaining Japanese pilots' thoughts turned from victory to survival. Captain Kenji Kojima Arakawa, one of the most experienced pilots in the Japanese squadron, found himself in the midst of the carnage. His heart raced as he looked around, watching his comrades fall one by one, their aircraft shredded by the P-51s. He had never seen anything like this before, not even in the darkest days of battle. His own Zero was damaged, smoke trailing from the engine, and his control was slipping. With each turn, the Mustang pilots kept their sights locked on him, their machines an unstoppable force. Then, a startling realization hit. Arakawa was not alone in his plight. Several other Japanese pilots, some of the best in the Imperial Navy, were now facing the same grim fate. As they scrambled to break off and retreat, they found their escape routes blocked. The sky was filled with Mustangs, circling like hawks, and there was nowhere left to run. In the midst of the aerial chaos, a few of the surviving Japanese pilots made a chilling decision. They began to radio for mercy, their voices cracked and desperate. The once proud warriors, who had spent years honing their skills in combat, now found themselves helpless against the relentless American attack. The words were chilling in their simplicity. "Please mercy, we surrender." For Arakawa, it was a moment of haunting realization. The battle he had fought so fiercely for, the ideals he had upheld as a soldier of the Emperor, had come crashing down. He had always believed that the Japanese spirit and the might of the Imperial Air Force would carry them to victory. But in this moment, it became clear that the war was shifting irrevocably in favor of the Allies. As the Mustang pilots closed in, finishing off the last of the retreating Zeros, the air grew thick with the sound of engines and the sharp cracks of gunfire. But for the Japanese pilots, their cries for mercy went unanswered by the unforgiving skies above. The decimation was swift and brutal, a sobering testament to the power of the Mustang and the inevitable change in the balance of air superiority. The aftermath of the battle was as swift and decisive as the engagement itself. As the P-51 Mustangs circled above the now silent battlefield, the remaining Japanese pilots began to descend, their aircraft either heavily damaged or out of fuel. A few tried to make a final, futile attempt to break through the American lines, but they were quickly shot down or forced to crash land. In a matter of minutes, the sky above the Pacific had gone from a raging sea of gunfire and chaos to an eerie quiet. The tally of the engagement was staggering. Out of the dozen or so Japanese Zero fighters that had launched into the sky that day, only a few managed to limp back to base, their pilots shaken, wounded, or captured. The majority had been torn apart by the relentless fire of the P-51s. The Japanese lost at least 8 of their best pilots, a devastating blow to their already weakened air force. The tactical advantage they had once held was slipping further away, their control of the skies now in jeopardy. For the Americans, the victory was a testament to the P-51 Mustang's superiority in combat. Not only had they neutralized a formidable threat in the Japanese Zero, but they had done so with precision, discipline, and overwhelming force. The Mustangs had proven their worth, not just as bombers' escorts, but as the ultimate air superiority fighters. For the pilots of the 353rd Fighter Squadron, it was a mission they would remember for the rest of their lives, a moment when the tide of the Pacific War turned irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The human cost, however, was undeniable. The death of the Japanese pilots was a tragic reminder of the brutal nature of aerial warfare. For many of them, this engagement marked the end of their careers, and for a few, it was their final flight. Their cries for mercy, a last vestige of humanity amidst the chaos, echoed through the skies as they fell to earth. But the consequences of this battle extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. For the Japanese military, the engagement signaled the irreversible shift in the Pacific Air War. The loss of so many skilled pilots, the very core of their air strategy, was a blow from which they could not recover. The Japanese Air Force would never regain the superiority they once enjoyed over the skies of the Pacific. The Allies, on the other hand, had gained a crucial advantage, one that would allow them to press further into Japan's defensive perimeter. In the days following the clash, the immediate consequences for the Japanese were clear. The loss of several experienced pilots and their aircraft, combined with the devastating blow to their morale, marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese, once masters of the skies, now found themselves on the defensive, no longer able to dominate the air in the way they had during the early years of the conflict. This engagement, though not the final blow, would contribute to the steady erosion of Japanese air power. For the American forces, the results of this encounter were a powerful affirmation of the P-51 Mustangs' role in the Pacific theater. The Mustangs had not only protected Allied bombers, but had now proven themselves as formidable fighters capable of overwhelming enemy squadrons. The victory was a critical morale boost for the Allies, reinforcing their belief that the tide of the war had truly turned. No longer would the skies above the Pacific be contested by equal forces. The Mustangs had changed the game. The Japanese response to their mounting losses came in the form of desperation. As their pilots continued to fall in greater numbers, the Japanese high command began to rely more heavily on the kamikaze tactics, which would later become synonymous with Japan's struggle to hold onto its dying empire. With fewer skilled pilots left, these suicide missions became a symbol of Japan's declining ability to maintain aerial dominance. The traditional dogfights of the past were being replaced with more reckless, one-way attacks, marking the shift from organized military engagements to desperate, last-ditch efforts. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the event would mark a significant psychological shift for both sides. For the Americans, it reinforced the belief that their technological advancements, combined with effective strategic planning, could lead them to victory. For the Japanese, it signaled that their once feared air superiority was no longer an invincible force. Over the coming months, the P-51s would continue to wreak havoc on Japanese formations, participating in bombing raids and providing critical protection to the Allied forces. The skies above Japan would grow darker for the enemy, as the P-51s became a constant, unyielding presence. Allied bombing raids grew more daring, with bombers reaching deep into Japan's industrial heartland, knowing that the Mustangs would have their backs. Despite these shifts, the Japanese refused to surrender, pushing the conflict into its final, brutal stages. As the war dragged on, the P-51 Mustangs would continue to serve as one of the most defining symbols of Allied air superiority. But the memory of that pivotal clash, when Japanese pilots begged for mercy in the face of overwhelming force, would echo in the minds of all who experienced it. The skies over the Pacific were forever changed after that fateful encounter, where the roar of the P-51 Mustangs pierced through the once dominant forces of the Japanese Zero fighters. In a matter of minutes, air superiority, a concept that had defined the flow of battle for years, shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies. The outcome of that battle would have repercussions far beyond the immediate loss of life. It signified a shift in warfare itself, from the dominance of one nation to the collective power of innovation, technology, and resolve. The human cost of war, though, was inescapable. The Japanese pilots, skilled and dedicated, found themselves on the wrong side of progress, caught in the overwhelming tide of American technological superiority. Their cries for mercy, a moment of vulnerability amidst the chaos of combat, stood in stark contrast to the calculated and relentless nature of modern warfare. Yet in those final moments, we were reminded that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict, the human element, fear, desperation, and the instinct to survive, remains the same on both sides of the battlefield. For the American pilots, their victory was not without its own complexities. They were warriors, yes, but also men who knew that the battle they fought, although necessary, was still a tragic affair. They were fighting for a future free of tyranny, but that didn't make the death of their adversaries any less painful. The experience of the dogfight, the thrill of victory, and the cold reality of having taken a life in the skies, these were burdens no pilot ever truly left behind. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, we see not only the triumph of technology, but also the inevitability of change. The P-51 Mustang, with its unmatched speed and firepower, represented the future of air combat, while the Zeros, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, symbolized the passing of an era. The battle, though fleeting in its intensity, marked a decisive step toward the ultimate Allied victory in the Pacific and the eventual end of World War II. Yet, as with all great wars, the lessons learned from these moments are not simply in the victories or the strategies. They are in the quiet, personal stories of those who lived through them, the pilots, the soldiers, the families, whose lives were irrevocably altered by the sounds of battle above the Pacific and the toll it took on their hearts.